All right. Well, we have tonight start a new series, and we're going to be talking about kind of a relationship to civil government. We've kind of set the stage for this study through our family camp discussion, and we had recommended even a couple of books, and one of those is the one that we're going to start looking at tonight, this smaller book called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate, and we're going to spend about 3 weeks in this book. It reads pretty fast. How many of you did get a chance to get this book? A few of you at least maybe did? Okay. Do you think it read pretty quickly? It's not too hard to read? Okay, good. So I don't think, we're looking at about 25 pages a week, so you can even break that up over the week into, I don't know, like 4 pages a day or something like that. So it reads fairly quick, and hopefully you found it to be helpful. Hopefully some of the things we talked about over the weekend, you can kind of see the connections, and we're just hoping to kind of drill down on these subjects a little bit further and establish kind of our thinking on it a little bit better. What I've done is I had you saw these on the way in, it's just kind of a sheet with some questions that I've kind of come up with through through the introduction and the chapters. And my plan over these next few weeks is just kind of a little bit of open discussion through these questions. So we don't have to answer every one of these questions. Maybe we'll pick a few of them and talk about them. And so feel free to, we'll be posting, I posted these online last night, and so we'll try to do that by Tuesday of every week. So if you guys even want to look at it in advance and prepare some thoughts or answers to that, you can absolutely do that as well. But I'd love for us to give our time to the questions and to the subjects that you really want to talk about the most, or the places where you have the most questions. And so we can definitely jump around in this thing anywhere that you want to go. But just for the purpose of tonight, I'd like to just start maybe at the very beginning of this. And in the introduction to the book, Truella talks about the kinds of desires that cause people to give up liberty. Let's talk about that for a minute. Do we see that in our culture today, where there is a tendency of people to give up freedom in exchange for something else? What are the things that people are willing to exchange freedom for? Like, they'll give up freedom as long as they get this. What are those things? What do you think? Let's talk about them. Comfort. Okay, what else? Safety. Okay, safety. Anything else? Comfort, safety. Money. Okay. You can get wealth off of it in some way. What else? Anything else? Okay. So maybe if you think like basic necessities are somehow tied to it or something, it'll be provided for. So yeah, maybe provision. Healthcare. Okay. Greater good. Okay. So let's get we kind of have spoken it generally. Now let's talk about some specifics. What are some specific examples of this in, let's say, the last 20 years or 30 years if you want to go, or 40 years if you want to go there? What are some specific examples in which you've seen people willing to give up liberties in order to, for example, feel more safe? What are some ways in which that's happened?
After 9/11, you had a lot of things happen. The Patriot Act and stuff, and giving up wiretapping privileges.
Good. So we're fearful about terrorist attacks, and so if the government can make us feel more safe against terrorists, we'll let them tap our phone lines. He's like, well, there'll be some innocent people that they're listening to too, but they'll get the bad guys. And so I'm more concerned about getting the bad guys, and I'll let you just kind of intrude. Okay? That's a good example. What's another one? Go ahead.
I think there's like 2 examples now. We can say the earlier example of what happened a few weeks ago when Biden said about the whole thing and that, it's against the Constitution, but I'm doing this for the greater good.
Yeah.
The second one, I think, has been the push about the gun ban push.
Okay, banning guns. So make people feel safer. We'll just prohibit certain firearms or prohibit them altogether because people feel unsafe when guns are around. So we'll just remove everyone's guns.
Even though that won't solve it.
Okay, even though that won't solve it. Yeah.
People just do status.
Okay. Good. There can be another weapon of choice in such cases, right? So we're going to take away all of our steak knives as well. All of those will be gone in order to stay more safe. Just think about all the machinery that causes. I mean, cars are kind of dangerous. There are plane accidents every once, so we shouldn't fly in planes anymore. And yeah. Hey, now I'm stepping on toes. You're the pilot in the room. Good. Those are great examples. Great examples. What else? Go ahead. Good. Yes. So convenience that come with apps on the phone and various other things. We end up giving a lot of information to a lot of people as well. Good. Did you hear even in the recent discussion, obviously for the last week, the big vaccination mandate stuff that's going on? But do you hear even our president mention the idea that his job is to keep us safe? Did you hear that? He used that language. And again, I would say, no, that's not his job. But anyway, unless you're talking about like foreign governments trying to invade then you can do that thing. But other than that, the rest of this, not so much. But notice that he used that buzzword there. Cassie, you were going to say something.
Well, you mentioned the vaccine. Like that's the most obvious thing at the moment is, businesses threatening, you can't keep your job, or even the government threatening that you can't, like in New York, you can't dine in, you can't do normal everyday activities unless you can prove that you're vaccinated.
Yeah.
And that makes other people feel safe.
Yeah. Good.
Just even masks and church closures and all that kind of stuff, just tack on Cassie's.
Yeah.
So all of that has been given up, sequestering everyone to their own homes,
Yes.
in periods of time as well.
Yeah, the lockdowns and
Eliminating the freedoms we have of movement. So
it's kind of interesting that I was thinking about the other day when a lot of those lockdowns were even in place here in Texas for some amount of time. And again, I'm sure there are counts of COVID, this, that, and the other, but at least in my own anecdotal experience, it seems like over the last few months, I've heard more of my friends and people getting COVID than back a year ago when we were all locked down, right? And what have people done while we've gotten it? Well, you stay home for a little while and you do what you need to do, and then you come back, everybody so it's kind of funny because the time when we were locked down, I hardly knew any of my family or friends that were engaged with dealing with COVID. But meanwhile, over the last few months, I've known a lot of family and friends that have gotten COVID, and we haven't been locked down, and people just stay home when they're not feeling well, and then we get back together when it's all done. So, again, you wonder about how these things come into play. But that I think he's absolutely nailed it on the head when he says this is one of the big reasons why people will give up liberty. Now, he also says that also growing ignorance contributes to tyranny. Why is that? How does ignorance play into a tyrant's, bag of tricks?
you don't know your rights that you have, then you have no idea how to defend them. So you have nothing, you no idea what to stand on, no idea, and so the tyrant will roll over that easy. So the Constitution's not being taught in schools, the Declaration of Independence not being taught in schools, so people come out of schools ignorant of their rights and freedoms.
Good.
There's also an idea that they are at the top, right? Instead of being accountable to the law.
Yeah.
The law that's in God's word, or the law that's in, how it's laid out in the Constitution.
Yes.
That's something we need to over the tyrant.
Yes.
Putting themselves at absolute crime, which is not true.
Very good. Yeah.
Clear in the book too, right? Saying that states are not God. God is God, and they are appointed by God.
Yeah.
He's creating laws that are morally correct for people.
Good. Yeah, you see the consequence of worldviews in all of this, right? So for those of us who believe that there is a God who is the ultimate lawgiver and the ultimate judge, then there's somebody who sits in the supreme place. But if you don't have that, it is inevitable that something or someone will take that place. So for the secularist, if it's not he himself, he is his own God, it is often the case that something like government might come into that position. And now government is kind of the trumping authority over everything else, right? And then the government gets involved in everything else. But it's kind of a natural consequence, I think, of a worldview that says there is no God. At some point, something vies for supreme authority. It's kind of an inescapable thing. What three well-known boxes do the America's founders believe in as it relates to liberty? According to Trulella. Do you guys remember what they were?
Executive, judicial,
No, he called three boxes. This is a funny thing. I thought this was a cute way of describing it.
ballot box,
The ballot box.
cartridge box,
Say it shorter, quicker, or slower. The ballot box,
jury box,
the jury box,
cartridge box.
and the cartridge box. These are all three things that help establish and preserve liberty. So what's the ballot box for? And why is voting important to freedom? At least in our founders' thoughts.
Let our voices be heard by people are the ones appointing the leaders.
Cool. So it keeps the leaders understanding that they're accountable to the people. They're servants of the people, not the other way around, right? We don't serve the government serves us. And they're accountable to us. And if they don't do what they should be doing, they can be voted out, right? So, okay, that's the voting box. What's the next one? The jury box. What's important about that?
If people don't serve on a jury, then it's the importance of people serving on a jury that gives the person who needs to be defended their potential for freedom in a fair trial. Against, and it could be potentially against a tyrannical law as well.
Yeah.
So it's not well known, but a jury can actually nullify law.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So I think this is something that juries don't often understand, because when they get instructions from the judge or from the prosecuting or defense attorney, whenever those instructions come to them, what a jury doesn't often understand is like they're the ones deciding, not the judge. The jury decides. So the law is supposed to be, made known to the jury, but the jury in their deliberations can decide on what they want to do. Which is another thing that I think that people in general don't understand. Like, well, if the judge told us such and such, it doesn't matter what the judge said. We're now in the jury box. It's now our role to consider this case and to consider even if the law in place is a good one. And that's a check on bad laws. So, for example, if there's a law in the books that says, Christians can't gather to worship Jesus, and we go, well, we're going to worship anyway, and we get arrested, and we get thrown in jail, and then there's a jury that comes up, and they're like, well, the law in the books, the judge said the law in the books is if you gather to assemble to praise Jesus, you're going to be thrown in jail or whatever else, and we can hold you for however long. Well, that jury can look at that and go, no, and they quit. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize, that the jury is meant to be another stoppage against tyrannical laws, laws that really are out of place. And it's a way that we individually can contribute to that. And so, again, I think with that in mind, it might also help you see what an honor it is. A lot of times it feels like such a curse to be selected for jury duty, but what an honor it is, we can actually play a role in establishing justice, right? In cases where somebody really has done something wrong, that justice is served, and where we don't think they have, that they should be declared innocent, right? So I think that was helpful. And then the cartridge box, what is his reference there? Guns, yes. So the right to bear arms. And we talked about this a little bit before, right? So certainly this can also include things like being able to protect your home and from robbers and things of that nature, but at least a big portion of that idea is that it also upholds the other freedoms that we're saying the government cannot infringe on. An armed populace is a deterrent against a tyrannical government. So, awesome. What other tool does he then say in the introduction is also needed? He says those three historic ones are good, but there's a fourth one that we should be acquainted with.
Doctrine of Lesser Magistrate.
Yeah, what this book's all about. Yeah, he's like, you should already know those three. But he's like, this is the other one that you should be familiar with, and that is the idea of the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate. So what is the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate? Somebody say it for us. What does it mean? What do we mean by that?
Someone that proposes
Great. Yeah. Good. So that word interposition is really important in our definition of the lesser magistrate. So the idea is that there's someone who stands in the gap between a tyrant and those who he intends to do harm to. And in general, when we're talking about in civil government, that means some lesser governmental authority. So the idea is that lesser governmental authorities have a role to play in stopping tyranny from happening. And certainly, there could be hardly any better time for us to talk about this than what's going on right now, right? The way in which many state governors, and by the way, Truel will go through this as well, right? This doesn't only refer to, for example, a state governor, but also refers to other places of authority, right? Like chief of police, county judges, Whenever there is something that a higher authority is trying to do to people below them, if there are intermediary authorities, they have a responsibility and role and duty before God to resist those things, to interpose themselves, even if it comes at personal risk and harm to themselves. And this would, by the way, this goes all the way down the line, right? So that includes my role as a pastor. I have a role and responsibility before God as a shepherd to interpose myself in your place. If I can protect you in some way, I should do that. This also refers to husbands towards their wives, dads with their children, moms with their children, interposition. I was talking to Sandra this week. Mama bears, right? That thing is a thing because mama bears no interposition when it comes to their kids. Like, you're not going to mess with my kids. But that should be the same thing. The governor of Texas should say, you're not going to mess with Texans. The governor of Florida has definitely been very consistent in saying, you're not going to mess with Floridians, right? So that kind of idea is what's behind this idea of the doctrine of lesser magistrate. I love the example. He gives several examples in the book, and I thought we'd maybe talk about some of those. One of the first ones he talks about is Emperor Trajan. What's so cool about Emperor Trajan? What did he do? What makes him memorable?
He's the one that gave the sword to his subordinate and said, like, use this against my opposition unless I become the opposition, basically. If I start going against the law, who's against me?
Yeah. I love that statement. He's like, with this sword, do my bidding against my enemies. That is, unless I ask you to do something that's unrighteous, then turn the sword against me. That is, so, it's like, if that kind of humility would attend the leaders of our nation, we'd be in such a better place. Like, hey, as long as I do what is right and true and good, then back me up on that. But those things, if I do something different than that, then resist me. Hold me in check. Don't allow my authority to spread very far. Yeah, I know. Yeah. It feels like so far from where our current governmental politics are in general, but should be where they are. Now, what document did lesser magistrates force King John to sign to acknowledge certain rights of men in 1215? What was that document called?
Magna Carta.
The Magna Carta. What was the Magna Carta? Why is it important in this discussion? What now? Yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. Anybody else? What's Magna Carta?
It gave rights like property and I taught about that.
It's like trying to summarize it now.
But it gave specific rights to the people because the king had overstepped.
Good. So it was protecting certain rights from the king, and what's interesting about the account is that it was a bunch of lesser magistrates, right? People underneath the king who came to him with swords in hand, saying, "You will grant these to all of us," and then they would force that upon the new king, at least in theory. That's what they were after. So the idea of a Magna Carta is kind of like the original Bill of Rights, but under that system of government where in many cases, like the king was the law, right? And this is the issue, is like Rex Lex or Lex Rex. Is the law king or is the king the law? And so what they're trying to say here is the law is king over you. And there are things that you have to submit to, O king. Like, you're not king over everybody. There's laws that are over your head as well that you're responsible to keep. So I asked the follow-up question here: should such a thing be needed in the United States, in constitutional republics? Why did the Magna Carta exist? It was mainly because there was a king who claimed all authority and all power, and that he would then delegate out things, favors to those whom he wanted to give favors and judgments to those whom he gave judgments, but it was pretty much all in his hands. Remember, the basis of our form of government is that there is no king, there's no hereditary king. The powers that the government have are expressly enumerated. They are numbered. They are limited. And so the idea from the very beginning was that you don't, and this is, remember, I talked about this a little bit at family camp. Alexander Hamilton says we don't need a Bill of Rights, because to say that the government can't do these things is to imply that maybe they had some power in such things, when they have no power unless we've told them they have that power. So since we haven't even brought up the press, they have no business talking about the press at all. Since we haven't talked about bearing arms, they have no precedent to remove your arms from you. So that was at least a little bit of his argument. Now, obviously, there were others, the Anti-Federalists, who were very concerned that if we didn't have these negative rights expressly spoken about, that the government would just do it anyway. And people like Thomas Jefferson were of that persuasion, saying, no, we need a Bill of Rights, and all the rest. But as we know today, we have a Bill of Rights, but who knows which one actually wins that argument, right? Because we see a lot of Hamilton's arguments being used by federal government today, trying to now express, well, what is freedom of speech? What is freedom of religion? Well, freedom of religion only extends this far, and that's that and the other. But at the same time, maybe someone else would argue if the Bill of Rights weren't there, we would have lost them long before now even. And that's also possible. We don't really know how that plays out. But at least understand that the idea of a Magna Carta in its original form was required because you had a king at the top of all authority, and so they're trying to, it's kind of a forced negotiation with the king. And the only way they accomplished it is because all the nobles gathered together with sword in hand and said, you will give this to us. So under threat of force, they were able to get their rights. In the United States, it shouldn't be that way. We have these rights given to us by God, not by the government. And so, but yet here we are. Now, we notice also in chapter 1 that John Calvin wrote about this doctrine. What did he write? What did he write about this? Anybody pick up on this? And where did he write about it?
I remember it wasn't a biblical part. I don't remember exactly.
Okay, good. Can anybody find it there in the book? If you've got it open.
It says about pagan historical examples, but it's in the Institutes of Christian Religion.
Yeah. So in his massive theology of that day, right? His kind of like one of the first systematic theologies that a Protestant puts together, right? You have the Summa Theologica and stuff like that, Roman Catholic systematic theologies, but Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is pretty much like one of the very first Protestant systematic theologies. And in there, he even includes some lines about the importance of lesser magistrates and standing up against these things. And one of the mentions I mentioned at family camp was that Martin Luther was a beneficiary of such a case, because Martin Luther would have been hauled off by the Roman Catholic Church had it not been for some German magistrates that said, no, you're not going to take our monk away from us. And they pretended like he was kidnapped, but really they took him away and put him in a tower, where he would then write the first German Bible, first Bible written in German. Really, really cool. And by the way, it's funny watching in history all these Christians under persecution, and they get jailed and stuff, and when they're jailed, they write. And the reason why we have books from them is because they were jailed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have their books. So they're trying to silence these guys, and yeah, maybe for the moment their words aren't being spoken from pulpits, but they end up writing in books, and those books get preserved. And now here we are today, reading works like The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. That was written from prison. Because the pastor was imprisoned, he wrote that glorious book. So anyway, I think that's always kind of funny. All right, so and then he also says in chapter 1 that there's a time when Christians have a duty to obey God rather than men. When does that happen? Okay, good. That would be true.
Or go against
Very good. Yes. So the idea is this: we should not obey an unjust law. To give credence or to obey an unjust law is to do something unjustly, right? So if I'm commanded to do something that I know is wrong, then doing that wrong thing isn't become right just because somebody above me told me to do it. Certainly the classic example of this is the trials after Nazi Germany is defeated and the Nuremberg Trials, and when all of those soldiers are brought before juries, and they said, well, the reason why I filled the chamber with gas is because my superior told me to. I'm sorry, you're still guilty. Doesn't matter who told you to do it, it was wrong. And that we need to be reminded of. You don't get a free pass just because somebody above you told you to do it. when what you were being told to do was wrong. In such cases, not only does God call you into account for that, but even your fellow human beings, in the right context, should call you into account for that. All right, so all of this is rooted in interposition, chapter 2. And he gives some examples both in history and in the Bible. Let's just do kind of a grab bag for these. Anybody throw out an example, either in history or in the Bible that we haven't already referenced for interposition. Either a biblical example or a historical one. What?
Petronius defied Caligula because Caligula wanted to put a statue of himself in the Jewish temple. And the Jews actually started the interposition going before Petronius, saying this is not going to happen. Petronius then stood up for the Jews, said, okay, it won't happen. Interestingly, there was so the message got back to Caligula. Caligula sent a message to Petronius, said, suicide yourself.
Yeah, kill yourself.
And then some other lesser magistrates ended up killing Caligula. And that ship got to Petronius before the suicide message got to him.
So the tyrant is dead. And then comes the message from the tyrant, kill yourself. Kind of reap what he was sowing there, didn't he? Yeah, that's a great historical example. What's some more? Historical or biblical?
Signing the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
13 colonies, and those men step forward to represent
Yeah.
everyone. To impose themselves
Yeah.
on behalf of all
Yeah.
citizens.
Very good. They risked their life, they risked their fortunes, their wealth, their position. They risked all of that, right? On behalf of the people that they were representing. And I think that message needs to be remembered. And I talked to Steve after actually family camp, and he was like, I don't know if you clearly stated what you felt at the end of all of that, because I had said it towards the beginning of the message, like all of this thinking has made me rethink the founders of the United States. And I remember for some time I was like, well, I think they were actually in rebellion against their authority, and so I probably would have been against what they were doing. I probably would have been one of those going back to England. And upon further and further thinking about this, I completely changed my mind on that and believed that they were doing the right thing by standing against tyrannical governments. And the Declaration of Independence, with all of its list of grievances, is very, very clear. They were not doing this on a whim. They even say at the beginning, right in the introduction, that most men, just because of momentum, like have a hard time changing things. So if we can at all make this thing better, I'd rather do that than scrap it and start all over again. That's a lot more work. And it's usually met with force because whoever happens to be in power at the time doesn't want you to scrap the existing governmental system. So they knew what they were going into was going to be very, very difficult. But after they had tried every other way of getting at this, and the king was completely resistant on all accounts, and he was destroying people's lives, like, we cannot do this any longer. And it's at that point they make the Declaration of Independence. So again, one of those things where if people don't actually read the document, we reference the Declaration of Independence, but even me myself, like in study for family camp, I'm like reading it and I'm like, wow, like I totally didn't understand what's going on here. This is just part of, again, that ignorance that we've all been a part of because we're not really given an actual good government class in high school or in college for that matter, right? Sadly deficient. What's any other examples? Interposition, Bible or history? Ah, yes, Esther. I was actually going to read from chapter 4 tonight from Esther, but what a great example of this, right? So there is a plot against the Jews, and Mordecai hears about it. He mourns, he tears his clothes, he's mourning in the gates of the city. Word comes to Esther about this. She asks him to get clothed and like all the rest, and so he sends message to her saying, they're about to exterminate our people. And he says, you need to do something. And she's like, well, if I do something, if I walk into his presence without being asked to be there, I could be killed on the spot. And that's when Mordecai gives the famous reply, and it's such a great statement from him. He's like, one way or the other, God's going to deliver his people. He'll do it with or without you. But then he says, but who knows if perhaps it wasn't for just such a time as this that you were brought into the position that you've been given. Such a great statement of that. And when Esther does follow through with that, right, she risks her life. She interposes herself. And she uses a lot of cunning and a lot of wisdom, right? She knows the way to a man's mind is through his stomach. She feeds him some good meals, and she butters him up, and then gets to the place where it's time to tell him about what's going on, and just really winsome, like an awesome example of interposition, and also using wit and kindness and thinking through the situation, and also courage and personal risk in order to save other people's lives. Any other examples? There's a great one. Hebrew midwives. Yes, another good example. The Hebrew midwives. And you guys know the story, so we'll move on. What else? What do you say? Jesus. Yeah. Yes, he interposed himself. The greatest example of, that's like the Sunday school answer. We were leaving it as like low-lying fruit. He's like, why is nobody saying Jesus? Aren't we Christians here? Thank you. Yes, Jesus. Good. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. And what about that?
So the police were coming, they would arrest pastors, and the people of the church found out that their pastor was going to be arrested, so they came and stood, basically like blockaded the church from, and so the police they're like, well, we'll just wait it out. They got to go home someday, and then more and more people heard about it, and eventually thousands of people came, and it actually started this huge revolution. 2 weeks later, the tyranny was dead.
Good. Yeah, that's a great example. There are some examples that he notes that can even be like almost like flips on interposition, and that's one of those, right, where the people even underneath that person are the ones that interpose themselves to save another. There's an interesting example of this when Saul makes a vow that if anyone eats on this day while we're trying to track down our enemy, he's going to be put to death. And he finds out later on that Jonathan, his own son, ate on the way. And by the strength that was provided, I mean, it's a stupid vow by Saul. Like, the whole thing is a stupid oath, but like, he vowed it. And so, but Jonathan eats, and from that strength that he gets from the food he ate, he's able to pursue the enemy, and they're able to have victory. But he comes back later and finds out about it, so Saul intends to kill his own son because he made this vow. And what's interesting is the people of Israel stand up against Saul and say, it's a stupid oath. We're not going to let you kill Jonathan for it. And Saul relents. So you have examples like that as well. But it is a form of interposition where people are putting themselves in harm's way in between the one who's going to receive some sort of unjust penalty, and they're willing to risk themselves for that. Any other examples? These are all good ones. What now? Moses. Yes, sure. Yeah. And again, so we see in all of the examples that we have in Scripture that we see there are people who are willing, by God's grace and by the courage that he provides, to stand in the place of wicked and tyrannical governments. In chapter 3, he talks a little bit about how all authority is delegated. We know that who is the delegator of authority, ultimately? God, right? And this is crucial, isn't it? Because that means then that the other authorities have spheres of authority in which they operate. If there is no God, then what happens for a lot of secularists is government is the ultimate authority, and they're delegating authority down. So then you can see from their mindset, well, we're in charge of education, we're in charge of marriages, we're in charge of families, we're in charge of the kids, we're in charge of businesses, we're in charge of, you see, that's where the government from a secular standpoint is like, well, who's in charge of all these things? Well, somebody's got to be the referee and the umpire and also the one playing, and that's what our government is now, right? They're the team and the umpire and the announcer, and they would be in charge of the whole thing. But from a biblical perspective, there are spheres of authority. And Truella mentions 4, and I agree with all 4 of these. What are the 4 realms of authority?
Self-government.
So self-government, so individual. So there's individual liberties and individual government. In other words, you have a responsibility before God and how you behave yourself, right? And there's individual responsibility. What else? Family. What else? Church. And then civil government. Good. So those are kind of like the classic 4 spheres of authority that God has delegated. And is the power of any of these spheres unlimited? No, none of them are, right? And this is a good thing for us to remind people about. Like, nobody thinks that when you say, even devout Christians who believe in like the headship of the husband in the home, they do not believe his authority is unilateral and unlimited, right? If he starts abusing his wife, he is out of order and there should be correction brought. So if a parent has authority over their children, right? But if they start abusing a child, that's uncalled for. It's wrong. So we all understand that. But for whatever reason, we live in a society today that believes in statism, right? Where, well, whatever the government happens to say, then it must be right. And even when it's wrong. And so that's one of the things we have to bring back is the idea that the government is also limited in its authority. And if it oversteps its bounds, it should be resisted. We are not doing them a favor, nor are we glorifying God to follow tyrannical mandates. We're not. We're, number one, telling them that they have a power that they don't have. And that's not good for them either. Further judgment will come to them for that. So anyway, I really have become more and more convinced that we have a role to play in speaking out against tyranny. And we would say that if I saw a fellow brother in Christ mistreating his wife, I would have responsibility to speak to him about that. Just as I would have to speak to a governor or the president if they're acting out of line. So in other words, the principle is the same. We have these spheres of authority. They all have their unique spheres. There might be some overlap at times, and we can talk about some of those. Those are more of the tricky situations. And I definitely have to admit, there's some such scenarios where it's like, well, how do you actually play out this? Who's in charge of this moment, right? So if somebody commits a crime, well, then there's a crime against the government. So the government should be involved in that, even if it happened to be like a husband does something against his wife, right? But he did something wrong against his wife. Well, if it's a crime, then the government's involved in that on some level. But otherwise, the church is involved in bringing correction too. And so, there are some places of overlap, but it seems today that it seems like today where we're at is that statism is kind of ruling, and the idea that the state has just decided what is right and wrong, and through the Supreme Court, they justify themselves to be constitutional or not unconstitutional, and thereby just justify their own actions. So just remember, all authority is delegated, and there are separate spheres of authority. That's an important principle to hold on to. In chapter 4, we talk a little bit about the duty of lesser magistrates, and he says there's a threefold duty. What is that threefold duty?
Oppose and resist laws or edicts from higher authority that contravene the law or word of God.
That's first.
Am I doing
Yeah, just keep going, Steve. You're on a roll.
Second, they are to protect the person, liberty, and property of those who reside within their jurisdiction from any unjust or immoral laws or actions by the higher authority. And third, they are not to implement any laws or decrees made by the higher authority that violate the Constitution, and if necessary, to resist them.
Awesome. A couple of the best examples of this recently, besides state governors' statements, I've really enjoyed chief of police statements, where even in some places like California and other places where they have just said, we refuse to enforce that. We took an oath by the Constitution also. And what they're asking us to enforce, we will not enforce. I remember in Montgomery County, there was examples of that where, hey, just so you know, we're not enforcing that. Not going to happen. So they can pass whatever they want up there, but we're not going to. It's that's what we need, right? We need every level of government should be a check on the rest of the levels of government. And as long as that's in place, then there really is a lot of strength in resisting tyranny. But if that's not in place, if everyone is just a bunch of yes men, then all kinds of tyranny can happen, and freedoms will be given up. Does a magistrate who upholds or follows an unjust or immoral law become complicit in the higher authority's rebellion against God? Yes, right? That's the answer there. So if someone's enacting an unjust law, and then you put it into place, and you uphold it, and you legislate with it, then you're complicit in it. So this is where then it gets into some brass tack situations, right? So I would say, for example, that Roe v. Wade, in the way that was pressed upon the entire nation, we should have all said no. The Supreme Court decision should have been utterly rejected. And what's sad is that at that time, I think you really had a supermajority of people that disagreed with Roe v. Wade when it was passed. It was the elites were pushing that idea, the abortion lobby and all the rest. But 50 years ago, if you even look at the way the Democrats spoke 50 years ago, it was much different than it is today. And if everyone had stood back 50 years ago, I really wonder what would have happened with Roe v. Wade. And for that matter, then the Supreme Court. See, this is what's important. The court also really cares about the fact that people respect it. The court cares very much about that. So much so sometimes that they'll not even go back on bad judgment they've made before because they want to keep I think Chief John Roberts is a good example of this, right? So a guy who is supposedly conservative, but now with every judgment that he's passing, it seems like he's shifted further and further liberal. But I think a lot of it, when you hear him talk, it's because he cares about the integrity of the court. So he's like, well, we've already made a decision back there, and so I want to uphold the decision we've already made. And I'm just like, you made a horrible, lawless decision back there. You should correct it as soon as you can. But again, the point being here is this. When we uphold or follow unjust laws, we're complicit in the unjust law. And so lower authorities ought to say no. We need to just learn how to say no a little bit more, right? I mean, at least for a long time, there was a big push, to tell kids, just say no to drugs. Just say no. It's like maybe we need to take that same campaign to our government officials and just say no. It's like maybe we need to take them back to kindergarten, start them through and say, just learn to say no. So this says, discuss some of the reasons why resistance by lesser magistrates is wise and necessary to turn back acts of tyranny by the higher authority. What do you guys think about that? Why is it wise and necessary?
I think it's wise because it's one person going against the tyranny instead of everybody trying to come together and hold up their guns or whatever. And
Yeah.
So their way of
Yeah, good.
There's an interesting thing going on right now, I think, in D.C., where they're trying to pass this $3 trillion bill, and one Democrat, Joe Manchin, is holding it up. And it would not pass by that one vote. And so Joe Manchin is this interposer right now.
Yeah.
Who's stopping in the gap between all of this. So we'd be praying for Joe Manchin that he holds firm.
Yeah, part of what you're saying here too is true. Like the idea of lesser magistrates standing up, and this is really what was behind even the ideas of nullification. Like Jefferson talked about this a lot. So his idea was that certainly the ultimate thing that a state should say to the federal government is, we're out of here. Secession. He said every state holds the power to secede. Obviously, other people say, well, that was tried and the Civil War didn't go very well for the South. But Jefferson would have said it was a voluntary compact. We came into this together, and you keep what you told you can have. And if you go beyond that, we can pull out. Like, no, that's not what we agreed to. So it's you've violated the contract, not us, and so we're out. But Jefferson would say a step before that is nullification. Like, it's a more peaceful way of going about things. You're like, no, we'll still stay in, but we're just not going to do what you're telling us to do there. Like, unconstitutional. And by the way, we as the state get to decide what's unconstitutional, not the Supreme Court. That's a branch of the federal government. So we decide, it's us and the Fed, and both of us can decide at any given time. You can say it's constitutional, we say it's not, and we're not going to do it. And then he said, well, if they don't receive that, if they try to force it, then you secede. Then you say we're not part of it. And you talk to Steve Kemper about Texas. So anyway, but I do think, so at least those ideas being in play are important. So the American populace understanding those concepts is important, because that itself is a resistance to tyranny. So it's telling the federal government, you don't get your say no matter what. Like, all the 50 states get to say whether or not that law is just or not. And if we say it's not in Texas, it's not happening in Texas. And for a lot of the founders, that would have been the way they thought about things. Even those who are federalists, even those who were in favor of a strong federal government, they would still have said, Madison is a good example of this. He was a strong supporter of federal government, but he still would have said, if the federal government does something against the Constitution, then all the states should just say no. But we seem to have, I don't know. Maybe it's just we're so ignorant, or we've lost backbone, or we just love safety and comfort too much, or we're scared about what the repercussions might be, or we look back to the Civil War and we're like, ooh, like that doesn't sound like a good time, or whatever it is. Or maybe we're just entertained to death and we're just like, I don't really care. I'm just going to keep to myself. And that's until they finally encroach on your own property, right? And take your own stuff and do something to you personally. Then all of a sudden you kind of have skin in the game. But Anyway, thank you guys so much for tonight. You guys have done excellent. That kind of concludes our time tonight. We will pick up next week. We're going to read chapters 5 through 8. This book is on Amazon. You can get it in like 2 days if you're a Prime member, a little bit longer if you're not. But it's a really great book. I really wish almost that we had copies of this that we could just distribute. I was just thinking about this, just be a really good one. And it's kind of short, and it kind of gets to the point pretty quick. So I think hopefully you're enjoying it so far. And we'll pick up with chapters 5 through 8 next week together. We'll be talking about the standard of law, and we'll talk about a few more historical examples together. All right. Thank you guys so much. God bless you.